Good evening and welcome to the July 15th, 2024 Finance Committee meeting. Will our Finance Director please call the roll?
Certainly. Honorable Mayor Tack.
Here.
Chairman Weber.
Here.
Going old school.
Tippett.
Here.
Alderman Clemmons.
Here.
Alderman Notes.
Here.
Alderman Powers.
Here.
Alderman Goshgarian.
Here.
Alderman LaVert.
Here.
Alderman Walther.
Here.
Madam Chairman, you have.
Thank you so much. Our first item of business tonight is consideration of the minutes from the Finance Committee meeting held on April 15th of this year. Like any changes or comments? I'd like to ask for a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? It passes. Thank you. Our second item of business tonight is the annual report of the Cemetery Commission, which will be presented this evening by John Anderson, the Cemetery Commission Chair. As per the investment policy for the Cemetery Commission, John or the Chair comes forward periodically with an investment update. John, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Chair Weber and members of the City Council Finance Committee. Appreciate your taking time for this, our presentation of our annual report for the Lake Forest Cemetery Commission. My report includes an updated status recap of the Lake Forest Cemetery's investment portfolio performance, how our investment approach and activities conform with our investment policy guidelines, and you should have received a copy of the policy guidelines included in your material and advanced material, as well as a few additional items that impact our current and projected results for the cemetery. Go forward here. So let's start with the presentation first here of our Cemetery Commission mission statement. Our commission and our commissioners' work is grounded in and directed by the principles in this mission statement, which covers our commission's core responsibilities, including stewardship of the cemetery and its resources, its financial assets, as well as the cemetery property and its natural resources, both not just for today, but also for many generations ahead of us in the future. For our financial and investment management responsibilities, the Cemetery Commission is guided by very clear guidelines and objectives, which are included in our comprehensive investment policy. Every year, our commission reviews this policy, and we then direct our investment advisor, currently William Blair, to follow and conform with the provisions of that policy. And we ask our investment advisor to provide a full review of our investment performance to our commission at each of our quarterly meetings throughout the year. Our invested assets are mainly intended to fund the cemetery's future operating expenses once all our burial graves and niches have been sold, and I'll present some projections on that in a bit, and also fund some of our capital improvements occasionally. The funds in our investment portfolio could also serve as a safety net for current operating expenses, but generally, our operating expenses are well covered by our operating revenues each year. That's certainly been the case the last several years, and our intention for the commission is to not touch, if you will, the portfolio to fund near-term, short-term operating expense payment. Our investment policy was updated 3 years ago, and under this investment policy, our commission is required to carry out a reassessment at least every 5 years of the performance and relationship of our retained investment advisor. And as I mentioned before, that's William Blair. So with that as background, the next slide presents a graphic recap of the total value of our combined investment funds at the cemetery, including our cash accounts. As indicated earlier, these invested funds are currently managed by William Blair, except for those cash reserves which are held in the city bank accounts. This recap compares our total asset value in a pie chart format at the end of the fiscal year, April 30th, 2024, versus the prior fiscal year in 2023, April 30th of 23, versus 2008. And 2008 was the year that we first retained William Blair to be our investment manager. As of April 30th of 2024, our total funds were roughly $13.1 million. And as noted at the bottom of this slide in yellow, that's a 13.7% increase over last year, year over year from 4/30/2023, and is generally in keeping, although somewhat above prevailing market performance in equity and fixed income markets combined. It's also worth noting that the value of our total combined funds have increased by 51% since April 30th of 2020, and I bring that up because that was sort of the start of a confusing time for us, the start of the COVID pandemic, and with a lot of uncertainty in the investment markets. And in that period of time, our portfolio has increased 51% over the 4 years. Our total funds have increased more than 4 times since 2008, and the Commission has reviewed our accounts, and we are very pleased with the performance of our portfolio to date. One note, our total cash available is roughly $1.6 million. It's about 20% lower than last year, and that's intentional. Our general rule is to keep cash in city accounts to an amount that is sufficient to cover a full year's normal budgeted operating expense at the cemetery, and that's running roughly $1 to $1.1 million a year. So with the recent completion of the renovation of the Memorial Gardens, which required a lot of cash outlays here and there, we've been able to now move more of our cash reserves into our investment portfolio, and we'll continue to monitor our cash reserves and may move more of this cash into our invested portfolio over the next year and beyond. In this next slide, the top graphic shows the distribution of our domestic equity investments. You have this in your material that you received in advance. You'll see that the lion's share of our equity investments are in large cap and mid-cap company stocks. And then the table below that over the past several years provides a comparison of our portfolio performance versus our primary blended market benchmark that we use. And that's per our investment policy. Our investment portfolio performance exceeded this benchmark for the fiscal year ending 4/30/2024, as I indicated earlier. And our portfolio's performance has exceeded the benchmark in 6 of the last 7 years. So we've had some strong results. Next, we look at the distribution of our investment assets as of 2024 versus fiscal year 2023 and 2008. Compares the distribution to our allowable asset allocation range in the policy, as well as the mid-range targets per our policy. As of April 30th, cash plus fixed income investments comprise 31% of our portfolio, somewhat intentionally lower than prior year and now more in line with our mid-range target of 30%. Our total domestic equity investments comprise 55% of our portfolio, and that's modestly above our mid-range target of 50%. And this proportion has increased with the improvement in growth in the domestic equity market performance. As for total international equity investments, they were at 14% of the portfolio, somewhat below our mid-range target of 20%. We had dialed down our international equity holdings in recent years with high volatility in non-U.S. markets. Likely we'll reconsider that over the next year or two as those markets stabilize. As you look at this distribution, you'll see that our investment portfolio is a balanced and fairly conservative and safe investment portfolio, and that's intentional. And as indicated at the bottom of the slide, until this past year when we received a $905,000 loan for the Memorial Garden expansion from the city, we've not had any loans or any outstanding loans, for that matter, since 2014. And during the past several years, during that time, we've been able to complete a number of capital expenditures and pay for that, including our North Ravine restoration and repair, repaved our cemetery roadways, and made some major capital equipment purchases for the cemetery, all out of the operating expenses or operating revenues that we have for the cemetery year to year. We've only had to dip into the reserves in our investment accounts on a very limited basis over the years to meet our obligations, and this was only for a very modest dollar amount and for a very short period of time, and that's been only a few times over many years at the cemetery. So strong results in terms of use of our funds. Speaking of capital expenditures, next slide looks at what has been going on and also what we're expecting for the year ahead. First, the second phase renovation expansion of the Memorial Garden at the cemetery was completed this year in the spring. The Memorial Garden Phase 2 project finished construction of the remaining niches that were originally contemplated when the Memorial Garden was designed and planned in 2020, but were actually deferred for a period of time. So now the Memorial Garden includes 1,846 columbarium niches with 414 niches added in this project that we've just completed. The project also included repairing and replacing the walkways throughout all of the gardens to make them more accessible, as well as needed improvements in grading and landscaping within the first 2 of the 4 gardens that you see as you come into the cemetery by the cemetery gate. As I've already indicated, the cost for this project, the Phase 2 project, completion project for the Memorial Garden, was largely funded by a loan from the city, and that will be repaid over 10 years from operating revenues generated by our services, and if needed, obviously, from realized unrestricted investment gains in our portfolio. But at current prices, the income to be earned from the sale of these 414 additional niches that we've added as part of the Memorial Garden would generate at least $2.6 million. So it's quite sizable. So what capital expenditures are we anticipating in the next few years? The cemetery is currently constructing a new maintenance equipment storage building that will house much of our equipment away from the weather and clean up the area near and behind the gatehouse. Currently, this equipment is stored outdoors and fully exposed to the weather, so we think this is an important investment for us to make. Also, the city's ravine consultant is concerned that the concrete trough in the bottom of the main ravine at the cemetery near the lake is deteriorating at a more rapid pace than expected, and we will be working on a project plan and design to repair that ravine this upcoming year. So we're putting money aside for that actual plan work, and then likely we'll proceed with the repair and reconstruction of that ravine in the following fiscal year. Next, I wanted to share with you at least our current projections for the cemetery. Today, the cemetery includes nearly 15,000 grave spaces, with 2,161 of these grave sites, that's about 15%, still available for purchase. The cemetery property also includes a few platted and reserved sections of the cemetery, as well as unplatted areas that have not been developed yet. And these could, over the next several years, provide more than 900 new graves in the future. So there's still clearly available grave sites in the cemetery. Separately, we now have more than 1,800 columbarium niches, as I mentioned, with our recently expanded Memorial Garden. And 1,234 of these niches, 2/3, are available for sale. So, as I referenced earlier, our invested assets are generally intended to are intended to cover and fund future operating expenses once all our grave sites and niches have been sold. And as shown here in this slide, we do not anticipate reaching that point for at least 65 years from now. And that's based on some very conservative projections that we've done, and we do it every year. Although it's interesting to note that our actual sales of sites was actually quite strong the last couple of years, and that has reduced somewhat that length of our available time frame, but only by a few years. So we do look at this very carefully, but it's nearly out to the next century. So with that as background, there's a picture here of a map of the cemetery and as it stands right now. I don't know if that prompts any questions for you, but I wanted to at least show that to you. So if the Finance Committee has any questions for me, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
I have a question, John. Thanks very much for your presentation. You had mentioned the ravine needing some upgrades and some enhancements. Do you have any estimates in terms of the
Not
cost?
yet. That's part of what we're trying to get to this next year, is to find out how big the scope of this is. It's as I understand it, it's the concrete or cement trough at the bottom of the ravine that is the major problem. And it's the ravine that, as you're in the cemetery looking east, it's that ravine that goes towards the lake.
Okay. How long has that cement piece been in there for? Is that
Many, many years.
many years? Okay.
I know it's been it's been part of our long-term history, I know that, so. But
Thank you.
I bet I don't know at this point, and we should find that out during this next year.
Any other questions for Mr. Anderson? John, it's been a pleasure.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yep,
We
thanks.
appreciate your leadership and service on the Cemetery Commission.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yep.
Our next item of business this evening is a presentation from our Finance Director, Elizabeth Holub, on updating us of fire and police pension board investments. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Chair Weber. I would just note for our new Finance Committee members and the public that may be watching, the July Finance Committee does have a very heavy investment focus. That's primarily due to the fiscal year ending April 30th, to give you an update on the performance of the cemetery fund and the police and fire pension funds, because those three funds are able to invest in equities. And so the other operating funds of the city are very limited in the scope of investments that we can make. And so with these equity investments, we can see gains and we can see losses. And so we've traditionally done these presentations to give the Finance Committee an overview of how those funds have performed from an investment standpoint. So moving away from cemetery and moving to the Fire and Police Pension Board, historically, the Fire and Police Pension Boards would come and give presentations on how they had done from an investment perspective. However, in December of 2019, Public Act 101-610 was signed into a law and was effective January 1st, 2020. That act required all local police and fire pension funds to aggregate their assets for investment purposes only. And so there is a fire investment fund and there is a police investment fund, to which all local funds had to transfer their assets to those entities with the goal of achieving higher investment returns through expanded investment portfolios and reduced investment management fees that would serve to benefit all local communities in the funding of their fire and police pension obligations. I would note that the local boards remain intact, so you have a fire pension board and a police pension board here that remains responsible for benefits and administration of the fund, simply not investment of the assets that are being held. So no need to have those investment presentations by the pension boards anymore because they're not responsible, but what we did include in your packet was the most recently available investment reports for both the fire consolidated fund and the police investment fund. So we have the March report for the fire pension investment fund. That is by Marquette Associates. A lot of information I know included in your packet, but on page 42, the most significant item probably in that report is the one-year return. As of March 31st, 2024 for the fire consolidated fund, net of fees is 15.2%. So that won't align specifically with our annual fiscal year, but is very close at March 31. And then following that report, you have the report from VERUS, which is the police consolidated fund. And again, that is as of April 30th, 2024 on page 48 of your packet. There is a one-year net of fee return as of 4/30/24 listed there for the pool of 9.7%. So they are tracking well. All assets have been consolidated. The litigation is decided, and so the consolidation was deemed to be constitutional. And so those assets have been aggregated and are invested now very actively. I just wanted to include as part of this presentation the specific Lake Forest returns for fiscal year '24. Police was 9.8% and fire was 10.67%. So we have good ending investment returns for both police and fire, the local funds, and those will do well as part of the actuarial evaluation to help us amortize that unfunded liability. So with that, I will be happy to answer any questions you have related to the fire and police pension fund performance.
Any questions for Director Holub? With no questions from the council, we'll move on. That was an informational item. Our next item of business is looking for approval of our fiscal year 2026 budget calendar. And the calendar, you should have those dates in the packet, but I did want to note that we have a workshop on Tuesday, November 12th, and that's due to the Veteran Day holiday on the 11th. And we also will have one on March 10th, a Monday, 2025. I'll look for a motion to approve the budget calendar.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Lastly, we had just a couple of points of other business. Elizabeth, do you want to touch on any of those or
Sure.
highlights?
These are all informational for you, but happy to answer any questions. As you know, the May Flash report now, we're making those available on the website and part of the e-news, so the May Flash report's available on the city's website. I did include the investment report specifically in your packet for April 30th, 2024, just so you could see how those other funds are performing that are not invested in equities, and presented to you earlier this evening, but those are tracking well. The second item of note is just this evening's city council agenda includes a few finance committee related items. First will be the second reading, final approval of the appropriations ordinance and rollovers. That will require a public hearing. So we will have that as part of the city council agenda. Also an item that includes an additional transfer in FY '24 from the general fund to the capital fund of $1.1 million. And that relates to two aspects. First, we budgeted a $500,000 transfer to the self-insurance fund for our medical dental plan. That plan had very good claims experience for the year, so we don't need to make the transfer to self-insurance fund, so we're recommending you transfer it to the capital fund instead. And then the other $600,000 is just due to expenses coming in lower than we had projected. So there was some expense variance savings that we're recommending for transfer as well. If you have any questions on those agenda items, otherwise we'll take care of those as part of the city council meeting. The next item, just also related to pension, we have a pension subcommittee of the city that is made up of the mayor, the finance chair, former Alderman Morris, the city manager, and the finance director. And we have a meeting scheduled with the city's independent actuary on Monday, July 22nd, to receive a presentation on the draft actuarial results for both fire and police pension funds. That will determine the required contribution for next year that will be included in the 2024 property tax levy. We've invited both the Fire Pension Board and Police Pension Board members to participate in that meeting if they'd like to hear that presentation. And I would just note, Manager Wisha mentioned that in relation to those investment returns I reported earlier of 9.8 and 10.67, our actuarial return assumption is 6.5%. So we were well above the actuarial assumption, so that is why it will be favorable in regards to the actuarial report. The formal actuarial reports and funding recommendations will be presented at the October Finance Committee meeting. The next item for information is the state fiscal year '25 budget has been approved. Included in the packet, beginning on page 55, is the Illinois Municipal League briefing on key items related to the state fiscal year 25 budget as it pertains specifically to the city. The only budgetary impact in the state's fiscal year 25 budget relates to the grocery tax. And the state legislature has approved the grocery tax being eliminated, but deferred that to January 1st, 2026, so it won't affect the city's fiscal year 25 budget. In rescinding that tax effective 1/1/26, the state legislature also authorized both home rule and non-home rule communities in the state to impose that 1% grocery tax locally. So it is our plan to have that as an agenda item for discussion as part of the fiscal year 26 budget development. That will probably be on your November workshop agenda for discussion. The annual impact to the city is about $525,000 per year in revenue by the loss of the 1% grocery tax. And I would just remind everyone that that was simply a pass-through. That did nothing for the state's budget. They would collect that tax, but then remit it out to the local municipalities. So that was a complete flow-through. And so that impact of that elimination falls on the local governments. The other good news is that there was no change in the local government distributive fund, so income tax distributions by the state will remain at the same percentage as the state's fiscal year 24 budget. Any state
Which
budget?
is,
Oh, you had to, it's 6.16%.
okay,
Was previously 10%.
right.
So we continue to try to get back to restoring our full 10%, but we didn't make any headway in the legislature for FY '25.
Excellent.
And then the last item included in your packet, well, I did also include, just for information, the Illinois Municipal League's spring legislative session summary, just so that you could see all the various bills that were approved that were of municipal interest. Obviously, staff in all departments go through that and see where that might affect city operations. And then lastly, included in your packet, again for information, is the IML state shared revenue projections. We heavily rely on the Municipal League's study. They hire a consultant that tracks results at the state level on these state shared revenues. And so I wanted to just share with you the publication that they put out 3 or 4 times a year, which remains very helpful for us in projecting those state shared revenues for budget purposes. So a lot of information included in your packet. I apologize for that, but it was all, I thought, good financial information related to the city's budget.
Any questions?
Yeah, Elizabeth, thank you. I have a question. Last year and a half ago, there was discussion on council about the census and an undercount within the city of Lake Forest, and indeed many communities and throughout the state of Illinois. Are those shared revenues, loss of dollars from that due to an undercount, substantial enough? I know we had a discussion last year about possibly financing our own recount, and we had some preliminary discussions about that. Have we gone anywhere with that? And just looking to see what we can do potentially to recoup, or if it's so small it's not worth pursuing.
Thank you, Finance Committee Chairman Weber, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. We did continue to work with the Census Bureau, as did many communities and counties as well. And there just is very little movement on special census. So it really hasn't come together. At this point, we're in 2024. We haven't been able to get a specific cost or a time frame. So it doesn't appear that moving in that direction is going to be a possibility, but we certainly are keeping our finger on the pulse of what the Census Bureau is doing.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
And Alderman Goshgarian raises that point because the budget impact to the city is that a lot of the state shared revenues are per capita based. And so if there's an undercounting, there can be a financial loss of state shared revenue associated with that.
Thank you. Moving on, the city council meeting will be taking place immediately following this finance committee meeting, where our public can address the council agenda items. But at this time, I'd like to invite any public with specific questions regarding our finance committee agenda. Any questions from the public? Not seeing any, I will go ahead and request a motion for approval of adjournment.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. We'll take a
30 seconds.
30-second break.
So generous,
The new one.
Yeah.
That goes too.
Aye.